Hello everybody! Automobilista out now? Tomorrow? I don't know. Doesn't say here. What I have here is a list of improvements we made to the physics engine. So only physics, lots of things we changed on in the audio, graphics and all that stuff. Some large changes, some small changes, but this is physics only. First of all, we changed the rates, how often per second all the physics are calculated. It was 360, we upped it, doubled it to 720, which is twice as good, so the physics are twice as good. Thank you for watching, enjoy Automobilista, do buy it, it's quite nice, and see you later. Of course, it's not that simple. What does it mean if we calculate things more often, 720 times per second? It means that if you picture a tire rolling over the road and you're doing super high speed, the physics doesn't sort of continuously look at where the tire sits on the road. It only takes samples, and now it takes twice as many samples. So if you hit a curb, for example, it will more accurately see the curb appear and the tire going into the curb. So the forces that it will calculate will be more accurate in those sort of conditions. And 720 it sounds like a huge amount, but remember, if you're doing 360 kilometers an hour, you're doing like, I don't know, many distance per second, 60 meters, 100 meters per second. Wow. This is the physics guy, he can't even convert his speed unit. So you're doing 100 meters per second. And you can imagine if you divide that 100 meters stretch up into 360 bits or in 720 bits, you get more detailed sort of forces going into the suspension and into the car. So it is more realistic. It doesn't make a super huge difference per se, but it adds some fine detail and it makes all the calculations more accurate. Things like curves and stuff more behaved, and that translates to the force feedback, for example, as well. Not just the physics rate has been doubled, we also increased the rate at which we read your wheel or whatever controller you use. This was about 120 Hertz, we do it at 500 Hertz now. So we look at your controller more often, so we get a more up-to-date, more accurate position of your steering wheel. Is this hugely important? It wasn't bad to begin with, but for force feedback you want as much change in wheel position as smooth and as accurate as you can to go into the physics. So increasing the physics and the input rates made a lot of difference. And then we go on to the force feedback, which is sort of related. Reading the inputs quicker and having better physics. We also upped the force feedback rate. If your wheel supports it, depends a little bit, we have some options in the menu. But basically it was about 90 Hertz and it was also limited to your frame rate. And now it's independent of frame rate and it can be up to 360 or even higher. Do we got 720? That doesn't really matter, at least we have 360 Hertz. Oh, he doesn't know his own game. Sim! Very much improved speed of the force feedback. So your wheel sends its position much quicker at a much higher rate to your PC, and the force updates being sent to the force feedback motors in your wheel are also a lot more frequent. So if you go over like a high speed curb and it has a high frequency rattle, you'll actually feel all those little rattles much better than before, because we only updated the force feedback not that often. We were missing out on some of the rumble of the force, like the rumble strips and the curves and stuff like that. Or even the detail in the micro texture of the road, which we have modeled. It all comes back into the wheel a lot more detailed. Perhaps, of course I'm spoiled, got a Bodnar steering system where you feel all those things. But even users with a lower end wheel will find it to be more detailed. On the force feedback front, as I have to look at my paper, we had a request a long time from users using a Logitech or other wheels, which have sort of a dead zone in the force feedback. So the initial off-center response is always a bit muted. And we've added a function in the control setup that you can sort of amplify the lower forces, so that around center you get more feedback instantly. And you used to be able to do this by changing like the real field plugin and all that sort of stuff. but then you would get a lot of clipping, and this is a way to increase the first forces, like the lower forces, so you feel more initially without causing too much clipping. So it's you feel more if you have a lesser wheel, basically. It's a nice improvement. Another thing in force feedback is the at low speed. Well, okay, let's take a step back. Physics are great and the physics engine works well. However, physics engines don't like to stand still. So when your speed is 0, the physics engine doesn't really work. There's a lot of speed is an important factor in all the equations, and you cannot divide by 0. And if your speed becomes 0, pretty much somewhere in the code there will be something dividing by the speed, and then crash the desktop, uninstall, all sorts of nasty stuff happens. So you don't want really to have the physics force feedback active when you're standing still. And sadly, the rFactor plugin that we use, it should have that, but that was bugged, it didn't work. So we added sort of a blend in. So now when you stand still, you got the parking lot force feedback, as we call it. So you get some weight and elasticity in the steering. And as you drive off, then that blends out and the proper physics feedback blends in. So when you're doing, I don't know, 10, 20 kilometers an hour, just really low speeds, you'll have the proper feedback. Why is that important? Well, some on the cars, for example, when you went out of the pits, it could shake the wheel violently because the physics were very confused and we're already applying physics-based force feedback, which was all screwed up. So we blend that in nicely, which is quite a nice little update. It doesn't really matter once you're driving, of course, you're always going to go faster than the 5 or 10 kilometers an hour, but it makes it more natural when you just drive away the pits and the wheel is more behaved. So that's good. Another little thing we've got now, if your wheel supports it, you can set the steering rotation, and for each car it will apply a reasonable steering ratio, so you don't have to change the steering lock from 14 or 22 or 30 degrees per car in the garage anymore, so that's nice. Another huge thing in the force feedback, which is a physics thing, but I'll come back to that, is we finally have proper pneumatic trail, self-aligning torque. And this might sound like voodoo to you, but it's a huge part of the force feedback. It's basically the tires part in the force feedback, which was attempted in rFactor, but they went the wrong way a little bit perhaps, and we fixed that. So now the tires physics force feedback part is close or exactly as we find in real data. That means that on most of the time your force feedback will drop off a little bit as your tire slip increases. You get a bit more detail, more feedback, and it's actually quite a huge change because it was physically just wrong how we did it, and now we do it physically properly, which I'm quite a fan of, as you can see by the smile here. So that's great. Yep, check. Did it. Yep. Drivetrain. We're not a train simulator, but we do have a drivetrain. We added some gearbox stuff, so for old-fashioned cars you might have to press the clutch or do some rev matching instead of it always allowing you to shift gear, so this could be more realistic if you wanted to anyway. We've got some more advanced drivetrain stuff, so if you downshift at a point where you would over-rev the engine by downshifting too early, it can refuse that. This can all be set per car, per whatever we want, but we have that option now, so it's more advanced. And we can have up to 9 gears instead of 7, which is a small change, but it does help. Another thing we changed was the engine orientation. So normally in a lot of cars the engine is in the length spins, like the drive shaft. What is it? Crankshaft. The physics guy doesn't know what the turning shaft of an engine is. The crankshaft usually on a lot of cars, racing cars, is in the length direction of the car, so it runs front to back in the car. But on a lot of front-wheel drive cars, four-wheel drive cars, karts, the engine is actually, the axle is spinning laterally, sideways, from left to right. And that is important mildly, because when you rev the engine, normally you get a bit of body roll in most racing cars. But doing it in a front-wheel drive car with a lateral engine, you would get a bit of pitch. It does impact how a bit of forces go into the whole physics, so we can do this correct now for each engine orientation, and the torque reaction on the body will be correct. For example, locking up the rear tires on a cart would suddenly stop the engine from spinning, and that would give quite a sudden torque reaction. And once that happens, now when we have the torque reaction instead of body roll causing pitch, it's more stable when you lock the rear end, for example, in the car. So relatively simple, but that's actually quite a physically logical thing that we finally did. And the daddy of all of this, which I've been kind of annoyed with for 7 years since I knew it was wrong, is how we have sort of the engine model, and we totally threw it out of the window and did it again. And this is a huge difference, a huge change, one that is also quite complicated, and we are still secretly learning a bit how to get the absolute most out of it. But it's a huge change. So what is it? And that's a little hard to explain. To the point where I don't know how I'm going to explain it to you. Well, at first of all, it gives us flexibility. In the old system, we had an engine and we put in throttle and out came a torque. And modern engines are quite different. For example, in a lot of ECUs, engine control management computer units, you can have a different throttle response for each gear, for example. You might be trying to put 700 horsepower to the ground in first gear. You might want a bit more control of the throttle sensitivity there, but once you're in top gear, you're going real fast and the torque of the engine is going through the gears and is reduced anyway. The throttle can be more sensitive, for example. That sort of stuff we can do, but that's sort of mapping. We also just changed the physical way how torque is generated from the throttle position. It just wasn't right. It was wrong. And well, let me give you an example. I love the idea of driving the Formula V12, but it's got such a high revving engine. I would never find the way, the sweet spot of throttle to get the maximum acceleration with a little bit of wheel spin, but not too much. So either I would be too careful and I would lose time, or I would be a bit too generous and then I would not get just a little bit of wheel spin. The engine would probably wheel spin up to the red line, by which point I'm leaving 5 skid marks, basically. What the new engine control gives us, engine mode, engine programming, engine model, physics, doodads, control over the throttle when you're not full throttle. So we can more accurately model how the torque comes and goes as you start to apply the throttle. So if you apply a little bit of throttle, you got quite a bit of torque, but you won't have a lot of torque right up to the red line. It will be more sort of low rev torque. So driving away with the clutch, for example, was quite difficult a lot of the time. The engine could stall quite easily. But now when you give it a little bit of throttle, you won't just go to red line and have a zillion torque, but at low revs you do have quite a bit. It's tricky to explain this, but rest assured it's flexible. We can change it whatever way we want for whatever car we want, even for each gear if we want. It makes more physical, logical sense, and it means for when you're driving, your throttle in a high torque car actually starts at 20% out of a corner. And if you look at the telemetry from the old model, you basically often you started at 50, 60% and only you have to modulate the last 40%. But now when you start exiting a corner at low revs, you start at 20%, you get a bit of wheel spin. Normally you would also get that wheel spin at 60% throttle. But if you get the wheel spin now at 20% throttle, you don't get the wheel spin up to red line, only up to 4000 RPM, for example. So it is a lot easier to find that once you bleed in the throttle, the wheel spin never gets out of control. You can sort of just optimize your corner exit. Still difficult, and it's to drive and also difficult to explain, but it's actually a really large change, which I'm extremely happy with. It was something that was missing and completely transforms the way you have to drive, the way you apply the throttle. If you start at 60% throttle now, which you had to do before, it might not work out so well. You kind of have to relearn applying throttle. But it's a big, huge change, very happy with that. The suspension we changed a little bit. We have some British cars coming which have the Dion rear axle, which you can probably figure out what cars that's going to be. And we modeled that now, so we have a physically correct suspension model of the Dion axle. Back to tires. they can now be flat spotted. You get some vibration and some grip loss. They can pick up dirt when you go off the track, which is not just a fixed parameter, but it's actually when your tire is hotter, they will pick up more and it will last longer. So there's a bit of cleverness going on there. That pneumatic trail that I mentioned, the self-aligning torque, not only changes the force feedback, it's a physical thing. It's the place at the car, the point where the forces are applied, and we actually change that more realistically. So it's just a more logical, physically correct way that we do it, and it means a slight change in balance and feeling of the car as we apply the forces to the tire at a better, more accurate location. It's very nice when you do logical things that have logical consequences. Very, very cool stuff. I'm gonna check how much time is left. Lots. So you're not done with me yet. What else is there? The tracks are now dynamic in their grip and response. So you can have like a green track which is not driven on for a long time. It will provide less grip and it's more uniform. But as more cars drive over it, which is a feature, it takes a long time, but you can accelerate this process. The more cars drive around it, with more soft their tires are. If you go driving around on rock hard road tires, they won't leave a lot of rubber on the road, of course, but soft racing tires leave a lot more. So the grip rubbers, so sort of the line rubbers in, and you get more grip on the line and more problems offline as marbles and stuff are deposited. It's not as dynamic and super advanced as, for example, iRacing do it, but our system is quite functional and it works, and it makes each time you go on the track with a different condition, it's not quite the same because the grip levels on and offline will be a bit different. So it's quite a nice change to that. Some cars have driving aids, and all the simulator freaks will go, ooh, driving aids, but ABS, traction control, is available on quite a lot of the cars, and you used to have to set this in the menu with like the driving aids, but now it's a per car thing. So if the car has optional traction control, you can set it now for it's applied by default for that car. Simple thing, but quite logical. We also changed the AI, not fundamentally, but we realized that as taking a step back, the physics from the AI is sort of derived, simplified version of the physics from the player. But the AI is not always intelligent, doesn't always know how to drive, and it struggles with certain cars. And we've sort of separated some of the physics parameters, so we can change a couple of parameters that we couldn't change before, exclusively for the AI. So we have more control over fine-tuning their sort of driving and handling. They haven't suddenly become super intelligent, that's to the extent, but they're in more sort of control of their cars, especially something like the Boxer Cup, which they struggled with the rear engine, for example. We can now tune them better within the limits that we have. We added DRS, so drag reduction system. It's been in there for a while already, but a nice feature that we might see on more cars in the future, so we might want to have that at our disposal. And a couple of things we never could do before. Certain cars you can adjust the anti-roll bars from inside the cockpit. We never could. And this is quite a thing, for example, in the Super V8, where you might want to change the balance of the car as the tires wear off, as the fuel burns off. And it's a very nice way to change sort of the under-oversteer characteristics of your car by changing the anti-roll bars, which you can now do. This is relatively simple, of course, but it makes the car more realistic and you can do stuff that they can in real life. So that's about all on the list, and I'm sure I forgot something, which will come back to mind as soon as I hit that red button on the camera to stop the recording. But it's not, that's the main point, we're not using rFactor physics just that anymore. Another thing, brain starts to work, there was a bug, more actually, but certainly one relatively big one in the rFactor physics, regarding the inertia of objects, which is kind of like, that's a big thing. When you're doing physics and moving weights and masses and turning them around and stuff like that. Inertia is important, and there was a bug in the calculation which we could compensate for, so it's not like it's light and day different, but just like with some of the other things, like the tire self-aligning torque bit, which is just now physically correct, like the engine model, we can now have physically correct throttle torque ref response, which we never could before. We're just doing it right now, and the same goes with that inertia calculation. We put in real numbers, we get real results. So it's not, and the higher rates, it's just not that rFactor engine anymore. Yes, we took it, it's extremely good. All race teams below Formula 1 basically still use rFactor 1 for their driver training. It's just really solid. But we improved certain things and we completely redid a couple of things as well. So enough to make me happy, and I'm not happy, well, I'm happy, but you know, I'm critical about stuff because it's got to be good, and if it's not realistic, if we do things, we fudge things or we do random things, then I want things to be physically correct, which we are doing most of the time now. So I wanted to give you that information before you head out and I'm being stalked at Skype. And by Automobilista, it's out now or tomorrow or I don't know when it's out. It's yesterday? No? In other words, lots of changes, small, big, but a lot of structural physics changes that make it quite a different experience. We also always change and update the cars to reflect like the handling improvements we made. So things like the Formula Risa was a bit more difficult to drive. The combination of all these improvements and iterations of just parameters of the car make them continuously more drivable and more fun to play. So if you ever hear somebody say it's just rFactor physics, well, I've just proved you wrong, which is what the internet is for, isn't it? Proving everybody is wrong except you. No, really, but I hope I've given you some information regarding the improvements that we made. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you will enjoy Automobilista, and I think I have an Ultima GTR to make, so it's 30 degrees and sweaty.